Good evening, and welcome to this month's Schuman Talk, where we discuss issues we face in Europe today in the light of Robert Schuman's vision for a community of peoples deeply rooted in Christian values. I'm Jeff Fountain. I'm speaking to you from the upper room in the heart of Amsterdam. And today it's Europe Day, May Day. I'm going to pick up my laptop and look out the window and let me see if it focuses. No, I don't think it's going to show you the European flag flying out there, because today is a very special day, Europe Day. What is Europe Day? It began 71 years ago exactly today. On May the 9th, 1950, at 6 p.m. at the Caux in Paris, when the French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman gave a 3-minute speech in which he laid the foundation for the European house, in which today 500 million Europeans live together in peace. This was the defining moment of post-war Europe, for it launched the European movement for peace and unity and has led to today's European Union. Speaking of a world peace to end centuries-old rivalries and of Europe's shared destiny and responsibilities to the world, he then proposed an economic project that was a political expression of Christian ideals of forgiveness and reconciliation. The proposal was for a European coal and steel community involving partner nations to cooperate in the production of coal and steel in mutual accountability, making the creation of a national war machine impossible. Now, has it worked? A lot of people say, well, the European Union really hasn't worked, but my son sent me this little graphic on my phone, and it showed the black years are the years when there was war between original EU members, and the white when there's peace. And I think that says a huge amount, and we should be thankful for it. And that's why today is a good day to stop and reflect on what it means to belong to a larger family of peoples. In fact, all sorts of things have been happening over this weekend, and especially today, under different umbrellas, to recognize that we belong to a greater European family of peoples, and to say, yes, we are together for Europe. This is European Family Day, and we can rejoice in the unity with diversity and all the richness of being part of this larger European family. But it didn't happen automatically. And if we stop and pause to think what Europe looked like at the end of 1945, when the guns stopped, that didn't bring welfare and shalom, peace. Really, it wasn't. It was the absence of war, but there was fear, there was hunger, there was bitterness, there was brokenness. And how do you rebuild such a broken continent as Europe was, suffering from a severe case of post-trauma stress syndrome? And that's why we are telling a story today that is not very well known, a story about an amazing place in Switzerland, right up high in the mountains. And we have with us, speaking to us from high up in the Swiss mountains, Andrew Stallybrass, who for many years has been involved with Mountain House in Caux, a center for the reconciliation of the nations. And if you know Lake Geneva at all, you'll see that Geneva is down on the western end, and at the other end is Montreux, the famous jazz festival each summer. And high above Montreux, at the level of 1,000 meters, is Caux, C-A-U-X. And here is where there was a hotel built over 100 years ago, 120 years ago, which has, for the last 75 years, been a center for the reconciliation of the nations. And we're going to trace some of that story today with Andrew. Welcome, Andrew. I think you can, we see you now. You're joining us from high up there in the Swiss mountains. Let me just introduce you a little bit. You were born in Liverpool in 1948, a year before I was. Your parents were involved in moral rearmament, which is the forerunner to what is now called Initiatives of Change. You have volunteered there full-time since 1967. Correct me if I'm wrong. And you helped to organize many of the conferences that have taken place there in Caux over 50 years, doing a lot of the public relations. You're a writer, you're a journalist. You're also a lay preacher in the Geneva Reformed Church, Secretary, Vice President of the Geneva Interfaith Platform, and you now live at the other end of Lake Geneva. We just saw that on the map, high above Montreux, with your wife there, Eliane. So, Andrew, describe the view you can see right now from Caux.
Well, it's a day much like that. I'm afraid I haven't planned to carry my computer to the window, but that's pretty much the view from my balcony. I live with my wife about 150 yards from the old Caux Palace Hotel. And it's a lovely sunny day. The sun is shining, and hordes of people are walking beside the lake down in Montreux, a sense of freedom coming with the vaccine and COVID figures going down, and masses of people going for walks around here, coming up the hill, discovering this village of Caux. I'd just like to thank you for that graphic that your son had sent you, and just add a phrase. Now, I mean, I'm not a professional historian, and professional historians may be able to sort of disagree with us and disprove us. But I think since 1945, Europe has had the longest spell of peace since the fall of the Roman Empire. So it's that scale. I mean, I'm wholly buying into your sense of wonder, really. I mean, we ought to wake up every morning saying, thank God for these men who brought about the peace and reconciliation of Europe, notably between France and Germany, because in 70 years they'd had 3 wars, 2 of them described as world wars, and they really were world wars. And World War II, there were between 70 million and 85 million casualties. So, you know, we're so used to peace. It's so far behind us, that trauma. But I think you set the scene very well.
Now, you're speaking as someone who lives in Switzerland, although your background is English. You don't have to be a citizen of a member nation of the EU to have benefited from this peace. This has been very significant. And of course, everybody knows who won the war. But what we're going to be addressing today is who won the peace and how was that won? Now, this view that we were just looking at is familiar to my wife, Romke, and I, and myself, because over the last 25 years or more, we have visited Caux many times, often bringing others with us on what we call the Continental Heritage Tour. And you've often kindly taken time to talk to our group, tell them the story that I want you to tell us today. So here's a photo of you talking to our group. I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, 3.5 years ago. And this is always a high point, of course, geographically as well as just emotionally. A high point of our journey is visiting this Grand Salon in what was the hotel built for the world's rich and powerful, and opened up in, I think it was 1902 or so. You can see how you get there with a funicular. The bottom right-hand corner, you see that funicular, the rail going up there, and it's a magnificent trip going up there. The alternative is to come up by car, and it's a hairbend ride, back and forth, going up these 1,000 meters from Montreux. Well, I don't know if it's 1,000. You're at actually elevation from the sea at 1,000 meters. Is that correct?
Yes, the lake is about 300 meters, so we're 700 meters above the lake.
Okay. So that's still a long way. And if you live in Holland, it it tests you in ways you haven't been tested in Holland. You know, the Dutch might talk about a mountain of 100 meters or something. Well, let's have a look at a few more photos before I ask Andrew to tell us more. Here we can see some of the richness of the decor from 100 years ago, and it's still got that same La Belle Épique atmosphere to it. And then the view from there. These are photos I've taken myself. I was staying there. What's the name of that castle down there that we can see?
The Chateau de Chillon.
And why is that famous?
Well, Lord Byron wrote a poem about the prisoner of Chillon, but it's a very old castle in very good nick, in a very strategic place, and
Lord Byron was the prisoner, wasn't he? I think I've seen his initials carved into a pillar there. Or is that correct?
No, he wasn't. He wasn't a prisoner there. But
he wasn't.
It's a good story. It's all part of the myth.
Yeah, we don't want the truth to get in the way of a good story. So
exactly.
Well, before you tell us about this amazing building, I want you first to tell us the moral rearmament story, Andrew, and the story of its founder, Frank Buchmann. Later, you're going to tell us how people can get a hold of the free PDF of this amazing book. It's one of the most significant books I've read, Frank Buchmann, A Life. And as I read that, I thought, why didn't we hear about this before? Why has this been such a best-kept secret? And then that's going to lead us back to this building after World War II, where very significant things happened in the very room that we saw you talking to some of our people about 4 years ago, that has helped to pave the way for forgiveness and reconciliation between former enemies, a first step towards the formation of what has become the European Union and a significant factor in this graph here. So, Andrew, tell us a bit more about this man, Frank Buchmann, and the moral rearmament story. Perhaps we can see his photo up there.
No, that's very good. Yeah, Frank Buchmann. He was an American Lutheran church minister. He actually visited the Caux Palace Hotel before the First World War, just for tea one day when he was in this part of the world. He was involved in social work. I think one of the things that has helped me to understand him is that I think he was really more of a prophet than the founder of a religious movement. He had spiritual intuitions that he followed. He was doing social work in Philadelphia with street kids, really, we would say today. And then the committee who were holding the financial, the money strings, told him to cut down on the food for the kids. And he couldn't accept that. He resigned. And his doctor said, I think today he would have said, you're having a bit of a mental breakdown or a depression. You should go on a journey to sort of clear your mind. So he went on a journey, a tour, and he ended up in a little church in Caux, as you see, in 1908. And he heard a sermon from a woman, which was quite unusual in those days, on the cross. And he suddenly realized, in that sermon, he felt convicted that he blamed, I think it was the 7 members of the committee, for ruining his life's work. And he thought, I'm the 8th wrong man for hating them. And as he walked out of that church, he decided to write letters of apology to them for his bitterness. And so I think the founding intuition of Buchmann's work, moral rearmament and initiatives of change today still is the idea that if you want to change the world, start by changing yourself. It needs to start with changing you. There needs to be a coherence between the values that you preach and the way you actually live. And then he started working with students in universities. He visited Britain, Cambridge, and Oxford. And he started working particularly with students from Oxford University and took a group to South Africa from Oxford. And that's where the first name of the group was the Oxford Group, because they were a group from Oxford. And then in the late 1930s, as everybody could feel the world was moving towards another war. Germany was rearming. And one of his friends, a Swede, said to him, what the world really needs now is a moral and spiritual rearmament. And he used that phrase in a speech, and it became shortened to moral rearmament. So in the 1938-39, that phrase resonated, of course, enormously in public opinion. And then moral rearmament was active through the war, partly in helping management and labor relations in the war industries in America and in Britain. And a group of Swiss who had been involved in this work of the Oxford Group before the war. One of them, a rather remarkable man whom Jeff and I have both known personally, Philippe Motu. In 1942, he wrote down in a time of morning meditation, if Switzerland comes through this war, we need to find a place where the enemies of the war can meet and be reconciled. Caux is the place. And I personally find it very deeply stirring how in war situations, there are some people who are already thinking, dreaming, planning for the peace. And Schuman was one, Adenauer was another, but one up among them is Philippe Motu, because he was dreaming of this place where the enemies could be reconciled. So he and his Swiss friends, they, in an amazing private initiative, they raised over £1 million Swiss francs to buy this hotel that was by then in disrepair, had been used to house refugees during the Second World War. And in 1946, the first conferences took place. And the story has it that when Bookman arrived with his friends in the front hall, he said, "Where are the Germans?" And excuse me, that's the tale of a cat that's wanting to get in on the story. And Philippe Motu was rather irritated actually by this story. I mean, it is true. Bookman must have said it. There are several records people of him saying, "Where are the Germans?" in 1946. But in fact, the first Germans were already in the house. And as Motu said, one of the main reasons for buying this place was to get Germans. So there were some Germans in 46, but in the following years, 47, 48, 49, there were many, many more. I think there were something like 5,000 Germans came here in the first 5 years. And my wife and I work in the archives, and I have here a copy of the conference report from 1949. And in fact, Adenauer came here in 1948 with several of his family. And he's described, this is Konrad Adenauer, who became Chancellor of Germany in, I think, 1949. Correct me if I say things wrong, Jeff. But here is just simple Dr. Konrad Adenauer alone, director of an electric power company. That's how he's described.
So we've got this photo of Philippe Motu as he was around the time when they tell us about the purchase of this hotel, because it's exactly 75 years ago, isn't it, this year? That's why this year is very special. And I think we have a slide just about the 75th anniversary. Perhaps we could show, because there, and we'll come back to this at the end of our time together, we'll give you this link again, where you can find 75 stories over these 75 years. All sorts of amazing stories. It wasn't just after the war, but the story has continued. And tell us, how did the hotel get purchased? I mean, how do you buy? It was the biggest hotel built in Switzerland at that time, the most advanced hotel. What condition was it in at the end of the war, and how was it purchased?
It was in very bad shape. It had escaped prisoners of war, refugees, then Jewish refugees from Hungary. It had been run by the Swiss military as an army camp, and the owners, the company that owned it, had gone bankrupt. The bank that held the shares of the bankrupt company would get rid of it, and they actually had a firm in, I think, Zurich, who were ready to buy the building to, in fact, demolish it, to recuperate all the tiles from the roof, the baths from the bathtubs, the toilets, to sort of use it as a I don't know what you call it, a store of building material that they would have taken away. And when Motu and a small group of friends visited this building in such a bad shape, the story is that the men in the party said, wow, this has potential. And the women in the party were thinking, good grief, what a lot of work, what a mess.
They were the realists.
They were more realistic, yeah. And then they went to the bank down the hill in Montreux and said, well, could we rent the place for the summer of 1946? And the bank said, no, we've got this firm that's interested in buying to demolish. We'll give you a week to decide to buy it. And in that week, they decided to buy it. And we have a little exhibition on the story. I find it quite moving. It's called A Group of Friends, because they really were a group of friends, most of them in their 30s, some older, but you know, and they decided to buy the place, and they actually created the legal body, the Swiss Foundation for Moral Rearmament, now Initiatives of Change, in the autumn of 1946, whereas all this process of buying, signing the contract was in May and June 1946.
Without a legal body, yeah.
Yeah, so the actual contract says between the bank and Philippe Motu and Robert Hanloser, acting in the name of the foundation in the process of being created. So they were a group of friends who trusted each other with a lot of money, 1 million Swiss francs, and who really put their lives on the line.
So they gave sacrificially from their...
They gave very sacrificially, about
the war.
100 Swiss families and individuals. It was an entirely private initiative. And I mean, whatever it is, 60 years, 55 years later, I'm talking with Philippe Motu, and he says, I'm absolutely amazed that the thing's still running, it's still going. So.
Now, then there were, you said they were able to have the first conference with several thousand people coming. And you've mentioned the name of Konrad Adenauer. Let's come to him in a little bit. Can you tell us something about this French socialist woman who so hated the Germans and who found herself up there at Caux, but when she discovered Germans were there, she wanted to pack her bags. Tell us about her. And I think we can actually have a little clip of the video that tells her story.
Well, should we see that first? And then I comment on it afterwards, or you want me to?
Just introduce her, yeah.
Just to introduce her. She was in the resistance during the Second World War. She was a nurse by training, socialist over a long period of time, married to a communist, and a seaman. And when she came to Caux, as Jeff said, she was actually then a member of the Constituent Assembly that was drawing up the new constitution. The new
That's like the parliament, or
the parliament, yeah. And she met Frank Buchmann and said she wanted to leave because there were Germans. And history can often turn on a simple phrase, a question. Buchmann said, what kind of Europe do you think you can build without the Germans? What kind of Europe can you build without the Germans? And it may be legend, I don't know. She is meant to have gone back to her room and not sort of hardly slept or ate for 3 days while she brewed on this challenging question. And then she actually had a meal with a German
Now,
woman.
this is a good point to start the video. Yeah. Okay. I think we're ready to, we're just going to watch this for 4 minutes or so, where she tells her own story. This is from the film called For the Love of Tomorrow. And it may be a fairly slow moving film, but it's a deeply moving film. And we're giving you, you can find the link. We'll show you how to find that later. And it's on Vimeo. If you just go to Vimeo and look for the Love of Tomorrow, you'll find it. And here is the address. But we're going to, I encourage you to, as listeners, to sometime watch this film. And tonight would be a very good time, being Europe Day. So, okay, we're just waiting for it to start.
I find it difficult to talk about the Germans. Much less so now, because I consider Germany to be my second home. But when those Germans spoke, I went out of the room. I couldn't stand it.
Et vous savez, j'ai voulu m'en aller.
I wanted to leave. That was when I met Frank Bookman in the hall. I hadn't any choice but to stop and tell him that I was leaving because there were Germans present. Then he said to me, "Do you think you can rebuild Europe without the Germans?" Obviously, it was impossible. Instead of leaving, I went back to my room. For 3 days and 3 nights, without eating, without sleeping, I had this terrible inner struggle to face up to what hate could do, even to a person like myself, who was human, who loved children. That hatred, whatever the reasons for it, is always a factor in causing a new war.
Toujours un facteur pour une nouvelle guerre.
I knew she'd had a very restless, difficult night, this issue of the Germans. So I went to knock on her door in the morning to get her to go to breakfast, as was our custom. And I'd had the thought that she might want to meet a German. So I said to her, as we walked quietly down the corridor, "Irene, would you like to meet a German today?" There was a pause, and she said, "Oui." And I said, "Shall we do it at lunch?" "Oui." "Would you let me arrange it?" "Oui." So we found ourselves there on the terrace, this German woman, her translator, Irene, and myself. We sat down with our lunch. And Irene never touched her food. She started right away looking at this German woman and pouring out to her a lot of the hatred, the bitterness, some of the scenes she had seen. You could see the perspiration on her forehead. She was flushed. And I thought to myself, my God, what have we done? We're putting this German woman who's just arrived through the pain, the pressure of this other woman's hatred. And then suddenly I heard Irene's voice saying, "I'm telling you all this because I want to be free of it." And there was a silence, and then the German lady said, "I'd like to tell you something about myself." She said, "My husband took part in the plot on Hitler's life. As you know, it failed. He and others were caught, and he was executed. And I'm left alone in the world with 2 children to bring up. But she said, I need to say to you that we Germans didn't resist enough. We didn't resist soon enough on a scale that was big enough. And we brought down on you and on ourselves and on the world endless agony and suffering. And I want to say sorry." So we finished our meal almost in silence. What could you say? And then we decided to walk down to the lower terrace at Caux, where there is that stillness, there are the trees, the greenness, that glorious lake. And we sat on a bench. All of a sudden, this person that I perceived of as a Marxist socialist, I heard a quiet voice saying, "I believe if we prayed about this, God would help us." So she said one sentence, and I remember it's something like this: "God, will you help me to be free of this hatred so we can build the future?" And there was a moment's silence, and then the German lady prayed, only she prayed in French. And none of us knew she understood French or spoke French. And Irene, who had absolutely, resolutely not shaken hands, not touched her, of course, reached over and put her hand on her knee. And she said to me afterwards, in that moment, the bridge across the Rhine was built. And that bridge always held, it never broke.
So the film goes on further. Andrew, tell us what happened then. She wanted to go back in and address the Germans.
Well, in the conference that was going on, she asked to speak, and she apologized to the Germans for her hatred. Yeah, it's a very moving thing where a victim, if you like, apologizes for her hatred because she's seen that the hatred is a seed for another war. And following that, she and a large group from Caux went to Germany with a musical play and
well, let me ask you,
other
Andrew,
plays.
before you get on to that, what was the German response?
Well, you'll see in the film, if you watch it, any of you, the response of one of the Germans who was there. He was a young, well, I was going to say ex-Nazi, but I mean a young Nazi who'd just come out of the army, who was there in Caux, and he was expecting her to attack the Germans, and he and his German friends were ready to accuse the French of a few atrocities, and he said that apology completely disarmed us. We didn't know how to take it, and it started a process in us of reflecting and a real honesty. He later became a member of the German Parliament. I knew him a little bit. You'll see him in the film. He says, you have to remember, in 1945, 1946, even a dog would refuse bread from the hands of a German. Of course, it's an exaggeration, but it is hard to understand, viewed from today, how much hatred there was.
And that's why it's so important for younger generations to hear this kind of story. Now, we see Irene here with a woman who's a German woman. What's the story there? At the top left-hand corner.
I think that's Rosemary Harver, who was one of the Germans who were there, and who accepted her apology. And
she came forward to take her hand. Is that right? After she spoke.
That's right. And in the film, you'll see Irene says, when I took her hand, it was like, I forget what, 50 kilos off my back. It's an interesting point that hatred, when we actually hate, there are always, usually good reasons for hating whoever it is we hate. But it's actually a burden on us, and we need healing and freeing from that hatred, not just for healing a situation, but for our own healing.
Yeah. Now, as you said, she was then invited to go to Germany, and she went on a trip, and she saw these sights of Berlin. How did that affect her?
Well, again, for younger generations, you need to understand that every single major German city had been bombarded by the Royal Air Force and the American Air Force. Most of them were around 50% destroyed. Some of them were up to 80% destroyed. So there's a sequence in the film of Berlin from the air, and you can just see the lack of roofs. The shells of buildings. And there was a Berlin airlift. The Soviet Union occupied the eastern zone, and they were trying to put pressure on the west. they blockaded Berlin, and for, I forget what, 18 months, I think, the Western powers fed Berlin by an airlift. And Irene Law and some of her friends went in on this airlift, and there are shots of her in the ruins of Berlin, with the women of Berlin, many of whom had been raped by the invading troops, and clearing the ruins literally with their bare hands.
And this is some of the most moving part of the film, I think. Yeah,
it is. Irene Law, in a way, is a sort of I don't know what, an icon, an emblem. But we have to understand that there were dozens, hundreds, perhaps thousands of people who were resolutely on the same path of saying, we must bury the hatred or we'll create the conditions for another war.
Yeah, well, let's go back to Konrad Adenauer that you were mentioning before. I don't think at this stage he had become the West Chancellor, had he? The Chancellor of West Germany. But this was so significant for him as he came there with all these. They were industrialists and politicians and church leaders and educationalists and journalists and so forth. Thousands of them. These were the only ones. Nobody really was allowed out of Germany, but these were exceptions to come to these events. Is that correct?
Yes, and you were brandishing Garth Lean's biography of Frank Bookman Alive. I was actually, in preparing this time, I was rereading the 2-3 chapters on this period, and it is really it's a fantastic story, and Garth Lean and his friends did a lot of historical research. It's worth really, reading it. And if you're at all interested in the history of this period, as you rightly said, Konrad Adenauer wasn't then Chancellor. In fact, he was post-war mayor of Cologne. As soon as the Allied forces liberated these German cities, they tried to find Germans who were not Nazis whom they could appoint to run the place. But Germany was really run by military governments in the different sectors, the British sector, American sector, Soviet sector. And Adenauer was made mayor of Cologne, and then he was fired because he was a prickly character, and the British felt he wasn't kowtowing to them. So he and the British governor didn't get on very well together. And one of the fascinating things in this story is how in Washington and in London, some of the people in the political setup who were really at the top sensed that Bookman, his team, his friends, moral rearmament could play an important part, and they opened the doors for these first delegations to come from Germany to Caux.
Now, the story of Adenauer leads us actually to the story of the French foreign minister, Robert Schuman, who didn't himself actually visit Caux until 1952, but heard about what was taking place in Caux, and as a result, he wanted to meet with Frank Bookman because he wanted to build bridges to Germany, and he has something in common with Adenauer. Can you tell us about that?
Well, they were both Catholics, and they were both men of the future. They were both already quite elderly men, but you can be an elderly man of the future. That's a rather amusing story, which I've not been able to properly document. But
it's good for you and me, Andrew. Yeah.
The first Germans who came, first big group of Germans who came in 1947, before they went back to Germany, Bookman had a time with them, and he asked them, "Who are the men we can build the future?" democratic future of Germany on. And one of them is meant to have said, Adenauer would be a good person. And the others all said, oh, no, he's too old. He's a man of the past. So he actually came to Caux the following year. And 1 year after that, he was Chancellor of Germany. So I don't think I mean, I like to say it as sort of almost as a joke, but when I do guided tours of Caux, I think we should never write off anyone as too old or as too young.
Well, eventually, because of the trust relationship that then began to grow between these two men, and sometimes it came to a strong test. I remember reading how that at one stage, because of the problem around the Saar area, at one stage Adenauer called Schuman a lying Alsatian. He wasn't there in the room, but then he remembered the co-teaching. But I know a changed world starts with a changed me. And so both of these men were very strongly schooled in Catholic social thinking, which understood every human being created in the image of God, and therefore there was a solidarity of the whole human race, and we had to choose for the common good. And so these were the principles that led them to think, how can we rebuild Europe on fresh foundations, on Christian foundations? And I think there's a photo there that shows Adenauer saying to Buchmann, he said, I consider it providential that the main task of rebuilding Europe is on the shoulders of men like you, our brother Alcide de Gasperi. He was also an Italian Catholic with strong Christian principles, and myself, who are filled with the desire to build the new edifice of Europe on Christian foundations. Now, this, of course, is usually left out of the story where we just look at the story secularly as if it was an economic and political construction. But these men understood that there had to be something much more than that. And I think the photo before shows eventually when Schuman does get to Caux and he's standing there with Frank Buchmann outside the entrance. Were you there at the time?
Oh, no, I'm much.
No, you would have been far too young. You would have been a toddler.
I was born, but I would have been a toddler.
Yeah, you and I would have been about 2 years old, I think.
But we have actually a sound recording of Schuman speaking as he left Caux, and he says, I leave Caux with a lot less skepticism, and at my age, that's no small thing. And I think he's in the process of being beatified by the Roman Catholic Church. And I think it's rather, I don't know, younger people would probably call it cool, but cool to have a new Catholic saint who was a politician. But I think if ever there was a politician who deserved to be a saint, he did.
As a Protestant, the whole idea of sanctification and so on goes against what I've been brought up on. But if ever there was a saintly man, I have not been able to find anything negative about this man in everything I've read about him. And in fact, there was a Swiss newspaper that wrote about him, said he was a very unusual French politician because he was humble. He was not a womanizer and so on. Well, all of this, of course, led to the reason why we're celebrating May Day, Europe Day today. And the trust relationship, particularly between these two men, Schuman and Adenauer, led to the very bold proposal that took the world by surprise on the 9th of May, 1950. To be honest, actually, Robert Schuman, who had been Prime Minister of France for 7 months, hadn't even fully told his own Prime Minister what this was all about. He was very clever, the way he put this on the agenda. And this was a very bold proposal that sometimes we can miss what it was all about. But here was a proposal to link the coal and steel industries of countries like France and Germany and any other country, democratic country that wanted to join them, into a place of mutual accountability, a supranational structure, so that none of these nations could build their own war machine. Now, it was a very practical and economic step, but it had as its goal peace. relationships of mutual accountability between the nations. And this was once this plan was put on the table on this date, there was a plan that actually kept things moving, even though we haven't always fulfilled the spirit of the plan as Schuman would have liked it. It has led to that chart that we saw earlier. And what I find really amazing is that basically Schuman's talk, the essence of it, only takes 3 minutes to read. Now, these were 3 minutes that truly shaped Europe. And so do you want to add anything to that? What you know about that story?
Well, I would just add my own personal sense of wonder at what for me is close to a miracle. There's a thing called the Eurobarometer, where the I don't know what you call them, social scientists have been asking people all across the European Union the same questions over a long period of time. So it goes back, I don't know, 30 years. The country that the French love and trust the most today is Germany.
Amazing. That is a miracle. Well, of course, if he's going to be beatified, there has to be a miracle associated.
well, you know, can you qualify that as a miracle? I mean, in my view, it is.
Yes.
You know, it's not a miraculous healing of an individual, but it's a miraculous healing of the history of our continent. Yes.
Now, all right. Now, we talked about the fact that this is the 75th anniversary, perhaps the next slide, where the story of reconciliation that took place straight after the war there in Caux has continued over 75 years. And you and others have compiled these 75 stories into the archives of the movement, which you now call the Initiatives of Change. Is that correct?
That's right. That's right.
And so here's the website where you can find all these different stories.
Well, just to correct you, they're not 75 yet. I mean, we're putting up 2 or 3 every week.
Okay.
And we're just getting up to the 1960s. And if I'm honest, one of the things that strikes me is that I can't think of a world problem that has not at some time been reflected, contemporary world problem, that has not been reflected in Caux. But a lot of them are problems where we failed, or at least we've not succeeded so far. In the early years, there were quite a large number of Indians and Pakistanis who came. And quite clearly, Bookman and his friends tried very, very hard to heal the relationship between India and Pakistan. Well, that is still an unhealed relationship today. One of the most recent stories you'll see, I think it's for 1960, is Cyprus. Cyprus independence. Moriarty, Bookman, his friends were involved in the backroom work of bringing Turks, Greeks, Greek Cypriots, Turkish Cypriots together to sign an agreement and to get the independence of Cyprus. Cyprus is divided today, and just last week there was a new peace plan by the UN Secretary General that was killed. My sense is that we have often failed, but at least we tried.
Yes.
And the intuition of Bookman was that behind every problem there are human beings. One of his friends who was a diplomat said, a British diplomat, he said, I often feel that the problems on the table are nothing like as complicated as the problems sitting around the table. In today's secular world, there isn't this, often we're not aware of the importance of the human factor, of working on human relations. As you've used the word building trust, the trust that was built between Adenauer, and Schuman. The current slogan of Initiatives of Change is building trust across the world's divides. And it's very hard to do. It takes time. One of the tragedies, I think, of the human condition is that evil that takes a few hours, a few weeks, a few months to perpetrate may take a few centuries to heal. I'm personally deeply upset about the Brexit. And that has threatened, it has endangered the peace process in Ireland, which is one of these slow healing movements that may take another century, but at least events were moving in the right direction. Now one cannot be too sure that the process is threatened. But I think each of us can ask ourselves the question, where am I, or am I involved in any historic processes that need healing, and is there any healing that I can do? I mean, of course, we can always ask ourselves these questions on a personal level as well, and work on our own personal healing. But the relationship between France and Algeria is an unhealed relationship. What can French and Algerians do to heal that history? There's an awful lot of unhealed history in the world, and sometimes we act as if history had no importance, but it doesn't. It matters terribly.
Yes. Well, tell us some of the people who have been at Caux for various talks, people whose names some of the listeners might recognize.
Well, one of my most moving evenings in Caux was with two Aboriginal personalities from Australia, and Kevin Rudd, who was then a former Prime Minister. He'd been Prime Minister of Australia and he'd just been kicked out. So he wasn't Prime Minister when he came to Caux. And they gave us an evening on the process of healing in Australia, of the Aboriginal history of Australia. And Kevin Rudd, go on YouTube after this time and type Kevin Rudd apology, and it will take you to Kevin Rudd's apology as Prime Minister of Australia to the Aboriginal people of Australia for the wrongs that were done to them. And for me, it is a sort of gold standard apology. It's not just sorry I trod on your toe. He says, for this we must say sorry, for that we must say sorry. And the evening in Caux, because he was a former Prime Minister, the person leading the evening said, well, Mr. Rudd, would you like to start off? Kevin Rudd said, no, this isn't my story. This is the story of the Aborigines. They must speak first. So they spoke and gave their insight into the story, and then he spoke. And it was a very it was one of the most moving evenings I've ever had in Caux. This is not a finished story, because human stories are very hard to finish. They take time, they go on. And the processes of healing in Australia are going on and need to go on.
Yeah. Well, I know you could tell many stories, and that's why you've put this archive together, that these stories are there. And one of the questions that I think some of our listeners may have in their minds is, was Moral Riyam, and it is Initiatives of Change, a Christian movement? And I know you mentioned the experience, you mentioned that Buchman was himself a Lutheran evangelist. He had this life-changing experience in Keswick, forgiveness. He himself stressed the need to listen to God. How would you present the movement? Is it a Christian movement?
I would say no, it isn't. It's, I would say, an interfaith movement. It tries to bring people together from all faiths and none. And as somebody who spent a good deal of his life trying to explain something rather difficult to people outside, I finally come to the conclusion that the simplest way of describing it shortly is a South African word that you may or may not have heard, called Ubuntu, which is translated, I am because you are, that we are dependent on each other. And trying to find an English word that sums it up, it's humanitude. It's our shared humanity.
But I think
humanity. But that takes us back to, I mean, Bookman believed deeply in the spiritual. And I think there is, in Christian theology, we don't often reflect enough and deeply enough on the spirit. The spirit that blows where it will, the spirit that doesn't wear a label, the spirit that is, well, it's hard to see. And I think Bookman had an extraordinary facility for sensing the spirit at work in the other person. And without wanting to put labels on it. And I hope if Initiatives of Change, Moral Rearmament, has a future, it will have to stay true to that intuition of the spirit. And, you know, some of the people involved in Moral Rearmament Initiatives of Change now, they're Hindus, they're Buddhists, they're Muslims. Some of them, like me, are card-carrying Christians. But we try to push the thing of the spirit.
Yeah, this pushes Christians to think, well, how do we actually interface with people with different worldviews? And the way I've often described MRA, Initiatives of Change, it was definitely a Christian-initiated forum for people of all faiths and none. And dialogue is necessary. Dialogue is not compromise, but dialogue, you have to speak from your position. You say, this is where I'm speaking from, but I need to listen to you and not just make sure, you know, be listening, really wanting to get my opinion across. Yes. And that's what I've experienced from my times there in Caux.
Yes, I think that's a very good summary of it. And I think all of us, wherever we are speaking from, need to recognize that the truth is bigger than us, is bigger than what I've got my hands on. It doesn't belong to any of us. That's why I rather like this thought of the spirit that blows. You know, it's a wind. You can sense it there. You can sense it in an event, in an encounter with somebody. You feel there's something in the air. Something's happening, but you can't always nail it down.
Well, Andrew, this has been a very rich conversation together. And just going back to, if you could put those links on again, we just had, because I'm holding up this book. This book in its entirety you can find on that website, as well as the link to the film For the Love of Tomorrow, and this where you will read. I mean, I kept saying to my wife reading this through, why haven't we heard about this before? This is amazing. This is, and we need to be telling these stories and passing these stories on, because it shows the influence that one man or a minority can have in shaping the future. And so, Andrew, you've told us many stories of hope. You give us hope for the future. And that's why it's so important on a day like May the 9th that we actually stop and reflect on how grateful we ought to be for these 75 years of peace, but also for the richness of the place that we live in, with all its diversity, as well as the degree of unity that has been achieved. I think we don't have to be part of the EU to have benefited from this whole story. So, Andrew, thank you very much for your time with us today. And we want to say next month we'll be back together again. We're going to be talking with Julia Doxat-Purser, with Crystal Nyambi and Ari de Pato, who've each been very much engaged lobbying in Brussels as part of the European Evangelical Alliance for over 25 years. And we're going to find out what has been achieved. What have they been able to achieve there in Brussels? And so in the same spirit that we've been talking about today. So that's it for today. And if you want to go and watch the rest of that film, I would encourage you to do so. Get hold of this book and check out some of the other resources, many resources on the site that Andrew and his friends have been putting together. Thank you very much for being with us. And Andrew, special thanks for you as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Bye.